All right, so we're going to talk about Unit 4 cells. Cells are the smallest living unit, and most are microscopic, which means that we can't see them without the aid of a microscope. There are some cells that you can see with the naked eye, but just most you can only see with a microscope. So we're going to talk about the wacky history of a cell. There's a video that I'll post on our Schoology page that you can watch on your own or we'll watch during class. So the discovery of the cell. So mid 1600s, Robert Hooke observed a sliver of cork, kind of like what you'd have in the wine bottles. Just kind of took a sliver of this cork and he put it under a lens and he saw a row of empty boxes. And so he called that term a cell. And the reason he called that is that he thought they looked like empty rooms that the monks lived in, which were called cells. So I shall call them cells. I guess modern day you would say that these kind of look like a row of maybe these cells right here look like a row of maybe jail cells. Just kind of this empty box. Then 1839, so quite a bit later, we have Theodor Schwann and Matthias Schleiden. And the pictures actually are backwards to the names on here. So this is right here. We have Matthias Schleiden, and that's him. And then Theodor Schwann is this guy. So basically, Schleiden, he said that all plants are made of cells, and these two didn't work together. They came up with these two ideas separate. So Schleiden is the one that mentioned that plants are made of cells, and then Schwann, this guy here, he said that all animals are made of cells. So we kind of contribute or lump them together. It was around the same time, even though they made different claims. The way to remember this is Schwann, kind of looks like the animal, a swan. And so he said all animals are made of cells. Part 1, cell theory. Everything living is composed of other cells. Then going on to the cell theory, we have Rudolf Virchow. He's credited with coming up with this theory. He was already an established doctor and scientist when he made the claim. He actually isn't the first person to have thought this claim. He kind of said, I agree with a few other scientists that cells come from other cells. So he kind of thought that. But then he's the one who's credited with making the claim, cells come from other cells, even though he might not have been the first person to actually think that thought. So part 2 of the cell theory, according to Virchow, is cells come from other cells. And so this diagram, you can see kind of this process of, we start with one cell right here, and then it starts to kind of go through this system where it starts to divide, and ultimately then we end up with two cells. Part 3 of the cell theory is the cell is the smallest basic unit of life. So according to science, one cell would indicate life. Principles of cell theory. So just reviewing, all living things are made of cells. All cells arise from pre-existing cells. This principle discarded the idea of spontaneous generation. So for example, there was a theory, someone left something out like a piece of raw meat, and then all of a sudden you have maggots or flies coming from that. They don't just spontaneously come from that meat. They actually come from other cells that are dividing, and the flies lay eggs and whatnot. So, but that idea that things can just spontaneously kind of become something is discredited when we said that all cells arise from only pre-existing cells. And then the third one here, smallest unit of structure and function in all organisms is the cell. So there are two basic types of cell that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So remember, cells are the basic units of life for all living things. There are two basic types of cells. We have prokaryotic cells. They're found in bacteria and some protists. Then we have eukaryotic cells. They're found in protists as well, fungus or fungi, plants, and animals. So I want you to make a really big Venn diagram on your notes at this point, and so we're going to talk about some similarities and some differences. So in the front, we have prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and these would be kind of this section right in here would be how they're, unique, how prokaryotics are unique, and then this section here would be what they share and have in common. And this last section would be how eukaryotic cells are unique. So I want this really big Venn diagram in your notes for this section. So what makes prokaryotic cells different? So going back to our drawing here, that would be the green section you're filling in right now. So they're much smaller than eukaryotic cells. They're less complex, so we think of them as being more primitive. And the biggest one right here in bigger font is that there's no true nucleus. So they have what's called a circular DNA that's found in the cytoplasm, but they don't have these organelles that are found in the cytoplasm. So here's an example of a prokaryotic cell. If you have your drawing that you had for class, make sure that you have some of these things labeled. So we have the capsule here, the cell wall, and the cell membrane. So here's the cell wall, here's cell membrane. Nuclear material, so that's kind of, it doesn't have that true DNA and nucleus. It just has this nuclear material, so it doesn't have that true nucleus where it's all kind of together. Then it has this flagellum, not always, but that's kind of a movement. Cytoplasm is kind of this liquidy stuff, and then this nucleoid is what we kind of call this center area, but it's not a true nucleus. So what makes eukaryotic cells different? So now we're going to focus on the right side of your Venn diagram. They're much larger, they're more complex, they contain a true nucleus that houses genetic material or DNA. They are linear. The linear DNA is packaged into something called chromatin. So it's not, remember in the prokaryotic cell that it was kind of all over the place like this, all over the place. But in eukaryotic cells, they're kind of packaged in nice little packages of chromatin. It also contains these organelles, which carry out a whole lot of functions, as you know, for the cell. And not all have a cell wall. So some can have a cell wall, but not all of them have a cell wall. Here's your diagram of a eukaryotic cell. And again, we'll talk about a lot more of these organelles later. You might have some questions on the test. They are review. You kind of studied them in 8th grade. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them right now, but we'll get into, we talk about the nucleus here when we talk about DNA, which is kind of a later unit. Oh, last thing, one thing I just kind of want to make note of right here is just that this shows an animal cell, but not all animal cells look like this, and they're not all round, and some are really, really long. Like they're about, in your leg, you might have a muscle cell that's almost, the length of, from your knee all the way down to your ankle. You could have, or from your hip to your knee, you could have a muscle cell. So some of them are very long and stringy, and some, some of your nerve cells have these kind of dendrites on them, and they kind of look like this. This would be like a nerve cell. So I just kind of want to make note that not all cells, animal cells, are this rounded cell that we see here. So what do they share? What do they all have in common? So going back to your Venn diagram, the, I believe, magenta center area is where you should be putting this information. So they all have a surrounding membrane. They have what's called a protoplasm, which is this thick fluid. They all contain organelles. Those are structures for cell function, and they also have a control center with DNA or genetic material in it. And so when I mentioned in the prokaryotes, yes, they have DNA, but it's not packaged the same as it is in these nice chromatin, chromosomes as they are in the eukaryotic cells. What else do they share? They have the same basic functions. They are surrounded by a plasma membrane to control what enters and leaves the cell. They're filled with the cytoplasm. They contain ribosomes to make proteins. They contain DNA to give the general instructions for the cell's life. And that's where we're going to stop today.